Please don't hurt my family. I will change.
Please forgive my husband. He will change. Do you see the trouble you have put us into with your running mouth?
There are men who carry knives, and there are men who carry poison. But the most dangerous man who ever lived in the village of Umuoke carried neither. He carried something worse. He carried a tongue that would not rest. And on the night this story truly begins, that tongue of his was just 3 words away from getting his entire family slaughtered in their sleep. 3 words. That was all that stood between Okonkwo's children and the cold earth of a shallow grave. His wife stood frozen across the room, watching his lips begin to part. She could not run to him in time. She could not strike him. She could not even cry out because the killers were already standing inside her own compound, smiling in the moonlight, drinking palm wine from her own calabashes, waiting. 1 word from her husband's mouth, and the blades would come out. 1 word, and the baby sleeping on the mat in the corner would never wake to see another morning. So this woman, this quiet woman whom the whole village had overlooked for years, did something that no one in all of Umuoke had ever thought of before. Something so cunning, so desperate, and so brilliant that the elders still whisper about it to this day. 3 generations later, around the dying embers of the evening fire. But to understand what she did, one must first understand the man she married and just how deadly a talking man can truly be. This is the story of Okonkwo, the husband who could not stop talking until the night his wife taught him the meaning of silence. In Umuoke, every man was given 2 names. 1 name came from his mother at birth, and the other name came from the village, earned through the years by the way a man lived. Okonkwo's mother had named him for the strong yam season of his birth, but the village had its own name for him, a name they spoke behind their hands, a name that followed him from compound to compound. They called him Umuoke, the talking bell, because a bell, you see, has only one purpose in this world. It is struck and it rings out for all to hear, and it cannot choose to be silent. And Okonkwo was exactly so. From the moment the morning cock crowed until the last oil lamp died at night, the man rang and rang and rang, and nothing on the green earth could quiet him. He simply could not hold a single word inside his chest. A word would enter his ear at dawn, and before the sun stood overhead, that same word had already traveled to every farm, every stream, and every hut in the village. And worse, far worse, the word always arrived fatter than it had left, swollen and bloated with details that had never existed in the first place. If a man's goat fell sick in the morning, Okonkwo had buried the whole family by nightfall. If a husband and wife exchanged sharp words over a cooking pot, Okonkwo had ended their marriage and sent the woman weeping back to her father's house before the food was even cold. Understand this clearly, for it matters. Okonkwo was not a wicked man. There was no malice in his heart, none at all. He was, in his own clumsy way, gentle and warm and quick to help a neighbor. He simply could not bear the unbearable weight of a secret. A secret sitting inside his belly was like a mouthful of scalding pepper soup with no water in reach. It burned him. It tormented him. It stole his sleep and chased him around his own compound in the dark. And the only sweet relief, the only cure he had ever known, was to open his mouth and pour the burning thing out onto somebody else. His friends had learned this the hard way. Tell Okonkwo nothing you did not want sung aloud at the next festival. The elders had learned it too, and they kept him far from the meeting house whenever serious matters were weighed. Even the small children had learned the lesson. If a child wanted the whole village to know a thing, That child needed only to whisper it once into Okonko's ear and then walk calmly away, and by evening it would be everywhere. Now you may wonder how such a man survives. How does a man with a hole where his discretion should be keep a wife, keep a home, and keep his own head sitting on his own shoulders? The answer to that question had a name, and her name was Adaeze. If Okonkwo was the loud and rushing stream that announces itself from a great distance, then Adaeze was the deep and silent river that says nothing at all, yet drowns whole men in its stillness. She was not the most beautiful woman in Umuoke, for there were younger girls with smoother skin and brighter beads around their waists. But there was something living behind Adaizi's eyes that made grown men lower their voices when they came near her. A watchfulness, a patience, the unmistakable look of a woman who hears absolutely everything, says almost nothing, and forgets not one single word for as long as she lives. The people of the village often wondered how the still water had ever come to marry the rushing stream. But the wiser ones understood. Ades had not married Okonkwo in spite of his endless talking. In some strange and quiet way, she completed him. Where he spilled, she contained. Where he ran wildly ahead, she walked behind and gathered up the broken pieces. And she had been gathering those pieces for many long years. When her husband's tongue had spread word of the village priestess's secret illness, it was Adais who went in the cool of evening, kneeling with palm oil and kola nut, to beg forgiveness on her knees. When his tongue had nearly set two whole families at war over a rumor that had grown teeth along the road, it was Adais who sat both grieving mothers down and untangled the lie patiently, thread by careful thread, until peace returned. She had spent the better half of her marriage walking 3 full steps behind her husband's mouth, stamping out the small fires he started before they could grow large enough to burn the whole village to ash. She was tired, of course she was tired, but she loved the foolish, warm-hearted man, and love is a stubborn and unreasonable thing that does not always bow to sense. It simply endures. And so, for the sake of that love and for the sake of the 2 small children they had brought into the world, a boy of 10 harvests and a girl of 7, Ades had built a careful and quiet life inside the roaring storm of her husband's noise. She did not know, she could not possibly have known, that everything she had so patiently built was about to be tested to its breaking point by a single desperate knock upon her door in the dead and dripping dark of a stormy night. It was the season when the sky grows fat and heavy and the rains come down as though the gods themselves are emptying their water pots all at once. On this particular night, the storm was so violent that the tall palms bent double and the lightning split the blackness like a cutlass splitting open a coconut. The whole village had barred their doors and huddled close to their fires. Okonkwo and his wife sat with their 2 children, the little ones drowsy, the flames crackling, the rain hammering on the thatch above their heads. And then came the knock. It was not the soft knock of a neighbor wanting sort. It was a frantic, desperate, pounding knock, the kind of knock that carries raw fear inside it. Okonkwo rose to answer it, and in that instant, Adais felt something cold crawl slowly up the length of her spine, a warning. But before her mouth could form a single word, the door was open and the storm rushed inside, and with it came a man. He was soaked to the bone and shaking violently, his eyes wide and rolling like those of a trapped animal. His clothes were torn and thick with mud, but Adaizi's sharp eyes saw the truth at once. These were not the rags of a common villager. The fine weave beneath the filth told her this was a man of importance, brought low by some terrible thing that haunted him in the night. The stranger fell to his knees on the floor of their home. He begged them for shelter only for one night, swearing that men were hunting him and that if they found him out on the road, he was surely a dead man. And Okonkwo, whose heart was soft as a ripe banana, reached down at once to lift him up, telling him to sit, to eat, to rest, that no man was ever hunted under the roof of Okonkwo. Adaeze said nothing at all. She fetched a dry cloth and a bowl of hot food, and she watched. She always watched. The stranger ate like a man who had not seen food in 2 full days, and as the warmth slowly returned to his trembling body, his tongue in its gratitude began to loosen. He told them they were good people, that they did not know what they had saved him from that night. And Adai's, hearing those words, felt that cold finger crawl up her spine for the second time, because she knew her husband and she knew that whatever this man was about to confess should never, ever be spoken aloud inside the house of the talking bell. She opened her mouth to stop him, but she was already too late. The stranger said he would tell them why he ran, because they had shown him kindness, and a man should not die with no living soul knowing the truth of his death. Adaze said quickly, gently, that he did not need to tell them anything, that he should rest, that the morning was always wiser than the night. But Okonkwo, his eyes had already begun to shine. A secret, a fresh, hot, important secret had walked right through his door on a stormy night, and the hunger rose up in his face so plainly that his wife's heart sank like a stone dropped into a deep river. He leaned forward and urged the man to speak, to unburden himself, to let it all out. And so the man spoke, and the words he chose turned that warm little home as cold as an open grave. He asked them if they had heard that the young prince of Umuoke, the only son of the old king who ruled across the river, had gone missing these past 3 market weeks. Okonkwo nodded eagerly, for of course he had heard. He had spread that very news himself. The stranger said the people claimed the prince had drowned or wandered or been taken by bandits on the road. And then he shook his head slowly and said it was all a lie. The prince had not drowned and the prince had not wandered. The prince had been murdered, and he, the stranger trembling on their floor, had seen the killing done with his own 2 eyes. The fire popped. The rain roared against the roof, and then the man said the words that no person should ever have spoken inside that house. He leaned close, his voice dropping to almost nothing, and he said that the hand that drove the blade into the young prince's heart belonged to none other than their own chief, Chief Ekweme, the big man himself. He had murdered the prince to bury a secret of his own, before it could ever reach the old king's ears. And now he haunted the only living witness left in all the world. Silence fell. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Adaize's blood had turned to cold water in her veins. Slowly she turned to look at her husband, and what she saw upon his face filled her with a terror deeper than any she had ever known in all her life. Because Okonkwo's face was not afraid. No. Okonkwo's face was lit up like a festival torch. His eyes were dancing, his hands were trembling, not with fear, but with that terrible and familiar hunger. The hunger to tell. He had just been handed the largest, hottest, most dangerous secret in the entire history of Umuoke, and every fiber of his being was already straining and screaming to let it out into the world. The stranger saw none of this. He only sighed, exhausted and relieved to have finally spoken his burden aloud, and he begged them both to tell no one. He warned them that if the chief ever learned these words had been heard, they were all dead, every one of them, the husband and the wife and the two innocent children sleeping in the corner. He made them swear to hold their tongues. Adai swore at once fiercely on the very heads of her children before her husband could open his mouth and ruin them. And the stranger, comforted by her oaths, laid down beside the fire and fell into the bottomless sleep of a haunted man who has, for one single night, found safety. But across the room, in the flickering orange light, Adaisi stared at her husband, and her husband would not lift his eyes to meet hers. That night, no one in the house of Okonkwo slept, except the stranger and the children. Adaisi lay on the mat beside her husband, and she could feel him shaking in the dark. It was not the cold, it was the secret, already burning him alive from the inside out. She whispered his name into the blackness and reminded him that he had sworn, on the heads of his own children he had sworn. She told him this was not market gossip about a sick goat or a quarreling wife. This was the very lives of their children. If a single word escaped his lips, Chief Ekweme would come in the night and leave no one breathing. Not her, not him, not the boy, not the girl. Okonkwo hissed back that he understood, that he was not a fool, that he did not want his own children dead, that he would not speak. And for one moment, lying there in the dark, Ades almost let herself believe him. But she knew her husband far better than he knew himself. She knew that a secret in Okonkwo's belly was a living, clawing thing, and that by morning the temptation would only have grown stronger and crueler. She knew with a certainty as sure as the rising sun that somewhere, somehow, in some weak and unguarded moment, the talking bell would ring. It was his nature, and a man cannot outrun his own nature. And so while her husband finally drifted into a thin and troubled sleep, Ades lay awake with her eyes open in the dark, her mind turning and turning like the deep and silent river she was. She could not change her husband. No power on earth could do that. To beg Okonkwo to stay silent was like begging water to flow uphill, like begging fire to burn downward. It was hopeless, so she would not waste her strength fighting his nature. Instead, she would use it. And somewhere in the deepest and darkest hour of that long night, a plan began to take shape in the mind of Adais, a plan so daring and so dangerous that her own heart pounded merely to think of it. But it was the only road left to her. To save her family from her husband's tongue, she would have to turn that very tongue into a weapon and aim it at the most powerful and most dangerous man in all of Umuoke. One mistake she knew, and they would all lie together in the grave. And here the tale must pause for one small thing. If this old story stirs something in you, tap that subscribe button so the wisdom of the elders does not die forgotten. Now, back to the house of Okonkwo, where the morning has come. The morning arrived washed clean and bright by the storm. The stranger rose before the sun, thanked his host with tears standing in his eyes, pressed a small carved charm into Adaise's palm as a gift of gratitude, and slipped away into the forest mist toward the river, hoping to cross to safety in some distant land. And Okonkwo lasted exactly until midday. He did not stand firm. He did not honor his sacred oath. But that was the way of the talking bell. By the time the sun stood high, the secret had swollen so enormous inside his chest, had pressed so hard against his ribs, that he could no longer draw a proper breath. He paced the compound. He sat and stood and sat again. He walked to his farm and walked straight back. The words "the chief killed the prince" rang inside his skull like a war drum, louder and louder until he truly believed he would go mad if he did not let them out. And so, telling himself it was only one person, only his closest and most trusted friend, Okonkwo went to the compound of his friend Umuoke. But Adaeze had risen early too. The woman of still water had not let her husband out of her sight for one moment that morning. She had followed him quietly at a careful distance, and when she saw him turn toward Umuoke's compound with that terrible shining hunger on his face, her heart leapt straight into her throat. She reached the edge of the compound just in time to hear her husband draw the breath to speak the deadly words. Now the tale must carry back a few hours to reveal what she did in that desperate instant, because it had its roots in something she had already set in motion before dawn. While the sky was still grey and her husband still slept, Adaeze had risen and waited. And when Okonkwo stumbled out after her, bleary and yawning, she had leaned close to him and glanced around as though terrified of being overheard, and she had whispered to him a second secret, a juicier secret, a more glittering and more tempting secret, a secret she had invented whole and complete in the long hours of that sleepless night. She had whispered that she had overheard the chief's own senior wife at the stream, and that the chief had grown terribly afraid because a powerful Dibia had warned him that all of his wealth was cursed, poisoned by a vengeful spirit. And so, in the dead of night and in the greatest secrecy, the chief had buried every last piece of his gold and his cowries and his treasures beneath the great silk cotton tree in the cursed grove at the edge of the village, planning to dig it all up and flee far away on the night of the coming full moon, when the spirits sleep. She told her husband that the chief had breathed this to no one but his senior wife, and that she now had told it to no one but him. She watched the false secret land in her husband's eyes. She watched it catch fire, buried treasure, the chief's secret gold, hidden beneath the silk cotton tree. Oh, what a delicious, glittering, enormous secret it was. So much sweeter to tell than a grim and frightening tale of murder. So much more thrilling, so much more tellable. And here lay the deep cunning of Adaeze, the drowning stillness of her. She knew that if you set two secrets before a man like her husband, he would always reach for the shinier of the two. She knew the talk of gold would crowd out the talk of murder the way a loud and joyful song drowns out a soft and mournful one. She was not trying to silence the talking bell, for she knew that could never be done. She was choosing with great care exactly which song the bell would ring. So now at the very edge of Umuoke's compound, when Adaeze rushed in and saw her husband's mouth already opening, she called out brightly, as if she had merely been searching for him, greeting Umuoke, teasing that she hoped her husband was not boring the poor man with his endless talk. The interruption shattered Okonkwo's moment. He stopped, flustered and blinking, and in that small broken pause, Adaeze caught her husband's eye and she gave him the smallest secret smile. A smile that said not the murder, you fool, the other one, the gold. And Okonkwo, bless his shallow and glittering heart, understood her, of course. The murder was far too dangerous and too frightening to speak. But the gold harmed no one. The gold was safe to tell. It was merely a delicious morsel of news. So when Adaeze stepped just out of sight, leaving the two men to their talk, Okonkwo leaned toward his friend, and instead of the murder of the prince, he poured out the secret of the buried gold beneath the silk cotton tree. He whispered, "All of it in the cursed grove." And on the night of the full moon, the chief would dig it up and flee. "But tell no one," he begged. And Nweki's eyes grew as wide and round as two cooking pots. Adaze, listening from the shadows, closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 1,000 years. The bell had rung, but it had rung her song, and her song alone. Now here is a deep truth about secrets and about that village and about all villages everywhere, in every land and in every age. A secret told to Okonkwo was a secret told to the wind itself. By evening, Nweki had told his wife had told her sister at the grinding stone, the sister had told the palm wine tapper, and the tapper had told the hunters, and the hunters had told absolutely everyone. By the second day, the tale of the chief's cursed and buried gold had reached every single compound in Umuoke, and it grew, as all things grow that pass through Okonkwo's world. By the time it had finished its rounds, some swore the gold could fill 7 barns, and some swore the garden spirit had the head of a leopard, and some swore the chief had already gone mad with terror. And here is the thing about a secret that everyone knows. It stops being a secret and it becomes a trap. Because you cannot pour a thing into every ear of a village and expect it never to reach the one ear it most concerns. It reached the chief. It reached Chief Ekweme. Now Chief Ekweme was no fool, for a fool does not climb to rule, and a fool does not murder a prince and hide the crime for 3 full market weeks. He was clever and he was cruel, and he was watchful as a crocodile that floats like a harmless log until the very moment it strikes. When the whispers of buried gold reached his ears, the chief did not laugh and he did not wave them away. He frowned, because Chief Ekweme knew he had buried no gold beneath any tree. He knew this story was false. But a false story does not crawl up out of nothing. A lie always has a father. And the chief, stroking his beard in the shadows of his great compound, asked himself the very question that Adaze had prayed with all her heart that he would ask. Where did this lie come from? And why? He sent his men out quietly to trace the story backward, from mouth to mouth, from the hunters to the tapper, to the sister at the grinding stone, to Nweki's wife, and at last to Nweki himself. And when they seized Nweki and demanded to know where he had heard it, the trembling man gave up the name without a fight. From Okonkwo, he cried. From Okonkwo, the talking bell, who swore him to secrecy and then told him with his own mouth. Here is where a lesser plan would have crumbled to dust and brought death raining down upon an entire family, because now the chief turned his cold crocodile eyes toward the house of Okonkwo. And if he had gone there and found a frightened, guilty husband and a guilty wife hiding the secret of a murdered prince, then all would have been lost forever. But Adaze, the woman of still water, had seen even this moment coming 3 full steps ahead, the way she always did. She had given her husband a lie to tell, yes, but she had also given him something far more powerful. She had given him a lie to believe, for Okonkwo did not know the gold story was false. She had never told him. As far as her husband knew, the buried treasure was the absolute truth, overheard from the chief's own wife at the stream. And so, when the chief's men came, Okonkwo would not behave like a guilty liar. He would behave like an innocent man who sincerely believed every word he had spoken. And there is no disguise on the whole of this earth more convincing than a man who does not know he is even wearing one. They came in the cool of the evening, the chief himself flanked by 4 of his strongest men, their faces hard as carved wood. When Adaze saw them stride into her compound, her heart began to slam so violently against her chest that she feared they would hear it. But her face stayed as calm and still as a pond at dawn. She had been preparing for this moment since the long and sleepless night, and she would not break now. The chief's voice was smooth and cold as river stone. He told Okonkwo that he had heard the man was telling stories about him, stories of buried gold beneath the silk cotton tree, of a chief planning to flee on the full moon. And he demanded to know where such a thing had been heard. And now came the test, the whole plan balanced upon the edge of a single blade. Okonkwo, sweating and terrified but genuinely believing his own tale, blurted out that he had heard it from the stream, that his own wife had heard it from the chief's own senior wife, that he had only repeated what was already being whispered, that he had meant no harm and had thought it already known to all. The chief's eyes narrowed to slits. Slowly he turned to face Adaze, and he asked her if his senior wife had truly told her this thing at the stream. And here Adaze did the bravest thing of her entire life.
She looked the murderer of the prince directly in his cold eyes, and she lied to his face with the calm and wounded sincerity of a wholly innocent woman. She lowered her gaze respectfully and said that she did not know whether it had been his senior wife or another woman, for there had been many at the stream that morning, and the chief surely knew how women talk. She said she had foolishly repeated what the wind was already carrying, never dreaming her husband would take it so far. She begged his forgiveness, offered her own back to be beaten if it would soothe his honor, and swore upon her children that she had only ever repeated a thing already loose in the air. The chief stared at her for a long, long moment, and then he believed her. Why did he believe her? Because every single piece of it fit perfectly. The whole village knew Okonkwo was a hopeless gossip who repeated everything he ever heard. The whole village knew his patient wife forever cleaned up his messes. A man hiding the secret of a murder would be terrified, would tremble with guilt, would never dare meet the chief's eyes. But this couple was merely guilty of the same foolishness the entire village already laughed about. The lie was flawless because it sat exactly on top of a truth that everyone already believed. The chief's hard shoulders eased. The gold was nothing but his story, a scrap of streamside nonsense blown out of all proportion by the village's most famous loudmouth. There was no true threat here. No one knew about the prince. His real secret was safe. And he very nearly turned and left. He very nearly walked away. But Chief Ikwime was a greedy man. And a greedy man, even when he knows in his head that a treasure is not real, cannot quite silence the small whispering voice in the back of his mind. What if, the voice murmured, someone started this story? What if there is something beneath that tree after all? And that single thread of greed was the very news that Adaeze had been patiently weaving for him from the beginning. Now, there was another half to her plan, the half that even her own husband never knew. For while Okonkwo had been busy spreading the tale of the gold, Adaeze had been doing the truly dangerous work in the shadows. She had taken the small carved charm the stranger pressed into her hand, and she had recognized it, for the watching woman knew the signs of her people. That charm bore the mark of the old king's household across the river, the household of the murdered prince. And so, telling no one, especially not her husband, Adaeze had sent word across the river, not with her own traceable mouth, but through a trusted old trader woman who owed her a great debt and whose loyalty was beyond all question. The message was simple and devastating. Your prince was murdered. His body lies hidden in Umuoke. The killer is Chief Ikwime. On the night of the full moon, he will go, alone or nearly alone, to the silk cotton tree in the cursed grove, believing gold is buried there. Send your warriors. Wait for him in the dark. He will come to you. Do you see the full and terrible shape of it now? She had used her husband's tongue to plant a false treasure. The false treasure would lure the greedy chief into a lonely grove on a known night at a known hour, far from his guards and his power. And there the prince's own warriors, silent and armed and burning for vengeance, would be waiting in the blackness. She had taken her husband's single greatest weakness and forged it into the sharpest blade in all of Umuoke, and she had aimed that blade straight at the throat of a king killer. But so much could still go wrong. What if the chief brought all his men? What if the warriors lost their nerve? Adaize did not sleep for the 3 nights before that full moon. She prayed to every god her mother had ever named, and she waited. The full moon rose over Umuoke at last, fat and white and watching like a great unblinking eye in the sky. And Chief Ekweme, that clever and cruel and greedy man, could not stay away. He had told himself 100 times that the gold was not real, but the worm of greed had eaten a hole clean through his reason. Just to look, he told himself, just to be certain. And if by some chance there truly is gold, then far better that I find it than some sharp-eyed farmer. He did not want his men to see in case the treasure was real, and he wished to keep it all to himself. And so he brought only 2 of his most trusted guards, and he went in the dead of night to the cursed grove. The grove was silent. The great silk cotton tree rose huge and ancient against the moon, its twisting roots silver in the cold light. The chief and his 2 men crept forward with their digging tools, their eyes darting at every shadow. He pointed to the base of the tree and ordered them to dig, and they began to dig. And from the deep shadows all around them, from behind the roots and out of the tall brass, and from the darkness between the trees, rose the warriors of the old king, 12 of them, silent as wandering spirits, armed and waiting exactly as Adaize had promised they would be. The chief barely had time to gasp. His 2 guards reached for their weapons, but it was far too late. The warriors fell upon them like a breaking wave, and the guards were overpowered in mere moments, and the great Chief Ekweme, murderer of the prince, was seized and bound and forced down onto his knees in the cold black earth, beneath the very tree where he had dreamed of finding gold. The leader of the warriors stepped forward into the moonlight, an old man with grey in his beard and a deep and terrible grief in his eyes, the captain of the murdered prince's own personal guard. He told the chief that they had searched for their prince for many weeks, and that this very night a message had come telling them the killer would be here digging for gold. He commanded the chief to tell them where the body of the prince lay hidden, and warned him not to lie, for the earth itself would be listening. And the chief, cut and broken, with 12 spear points pressed to his throat, and no power left in all the world to save him, confessed. He confessed everything: the murder, the reason for it, the hiding place of the body, every last word. And as he spoke, he did not know, and he would never know, that the trap which had swallowed him had been woven thread by patient thread by a single quiet woman of still water, using nothing in this world but the loose and foolish tongue of a talkative husband. The body of the prince was recovered from where the chief had buried him near the river, and he was carried home across the water with great honor, and the old king wept over his son, and the whole land mourned. Chief Ekweme was dragged away to face the justice of the old king's court, and that is a justice no man would wish upon himself, for a king does not show mercy to the murderer of his only son. He never returned to Umuoke. His great compound stood empty until the bush swallowed it whole, and his name became a curse that mothers used to frighten disobedient children into their beds. And in the village of Umuoke, the people marveled at how the wicked chief had been undone, though almost none of them ever knew the truth of it. The story they told was simple. The chief's own greed had lured him into a grove chasing gold that was never there, and the prince's warriors had been waiting. They called it the justice of the gods. Only one single soul in all of Umuoke knew the whole and complete truth of what had happened, and she said nothing. Of course she said nothing. She was Adaeze, the woman of still water, the keeper of the deepest secret of them all. And so comes the meaning of the tale's very name, the talkative husband who would not stop talking until his wife did this to him. Some might imagine she beat him. Some might imagine she sewed his lips shut, or poured hot pepper upon his tongue, or bound a charm around his mouth. No, what Adaeze did was far greater than any of these small things.
When it was all over, when the chief was gone and the danger had passed, and the children slept safely once more, Adaeze sat her husband down beside the fire, on a quiet night much like the stormy one when the stranger had first come to their door, and she told him the truth, all of it. She told him that there had never been any gold, that she had invented every glittering piece of it. She told him how she had used his tongue, his loose and foolish and dangerous and beloved tongue, to plant the lie and lure the chief and save their lives and avenge a murdered prince. And she told him that the true secret, the secret of the murder, had been buried so deep beneath the shining lie of the gold that it had never once escaped his lips. And Okonkwo, the talking bell, sat in silence. Real and total silence, perhaps the first true silence of his entire life. He understood at long last the terrible power that lived inside his own mouth. He understood how close he had come to laying his own children in the cold earth. He understood that he had been saved not by any strength of his own, for he had none in such matters, but by the patient and watching and brilliant wisdom of the quiet woman he had married and never once truly seen. And the loud man wept quietly. He whispered to her that for all these years he had thought her merely the silent one, the one who followed behind him, and that he had never known she was the one holding the whole world together. And Adaeze took his hand and smiled her still water smile and spoke the words that became a kind of law in their home for all their remaining years. She told him that a mouth which never closes is like a barn with no door, for everything precious rushes out and everything dangerous rushes in. She told him she could not close his door for him, that no one could, but that she had learned this one thing. If she could not stop the water from flowing, then she could choose the channel through which it flowed. And so from that day on, whenever a secret burned in his belly, he would bring it first to her, and together they would decide which song the bell should ring. And so the story ends, but the man himself was changed. Okonkwo never fully stopped talking, for a leopard does not wash away its spots, and a river does not forget how to flow, and he remained a talker until the day he died. But from that night onward, he carried something new inside him, a deep respect for the weight of words. Before he spoke a serious thing, he would pause, and in that pause, he would think of his wife and of the night the secret almost destroyed them all. And whenever a true and heavy and dangerous secret came to him, he would close his mouth and walk, sometimes for many miles, to carry it first to Adaeze. And the people of Umuoke, who had once called him the talking bell, slowly began to notice that the bell had grown wiser, that it rang less often, and that when it did ring, there was sometimes truth in it now, and never again such danger. And they never knew why. They never knew that behind the changed man stood a still and watching woman who had once saved an entire family and avenged a murdered prince using nothing but a foolish tongue and her own bottomless and silent wisdom. So, what does this old tale teach? It teaches that a loud man is not always strong and a quiet woman is not always weak. The river that rushes and roars is often shallow enough to wade across on foot, but the river that lies still and says nothing at all is deep enough to drown a king. It teaches that a person's nature cannot always be changed, but a wise heart does not waste its strength fighting the river. A wise heart digs a new channel and lets the water do the work. And above all, it teaches that words are never small things. A single word can build a home or burn it to the ground. A tongue can be a foolish thing that nearly buries one's own children. Or in the right hands and guided by the right wisdom, it can become the sharpest weapon ever raised against a wicked and powerful man. So, let every listener guard their words, and anyone the gods have blessed with a quiet and watching partner who sees 3 steps ahead of the world should thank them with their whole heart, for that is a treasure far greater than any gold buried beneath any tree. This has been the tale of the talkative husband who would not stop talking until his wife did this to him. If this story moved your heart, share it with someone who talks too much and with someone who knows the deep power of silence. And for more tales like this one, subscribe and follow this fire so the stories of the ancestors live on for one more generation. Until the next tale, may your words be few and may your wisdom run as deep as the still and silent river.